Britain's empire was now a global triangle: sugar from the Caribbean, slaves from Africa, and profits flooding into London. But across the Atlantic, another story was unfolding. On the edges of a vast continent, small, fragile settlements clung to survival. Some would fail spectacularly, like Roanoke. Others, like Jamestown and Plymouth, would not only survive, but grow into societies that would one day challenge Britain's empire itself. Welcome to the story of how England planted its first real roots in North America, with tobacco, Puritans, and plenty of conflict along the way. By the early 1600s, England had tasted blood in empire building. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 gave it confidence. The sugar colonies gave it profits. But what about the vast lands of North America? To some English thinkers, this was destiny. To others, a colossal gamble. And to the native peoples already living there, a nightmare about to begin. Today, we'll explore how Jamestown in Virginia clawed its way back from starvation, how Puritan New England built a society out of religious zeal, and how both collided with indigenous nations who had no intention of letting colonists take their land. Our story begins in 1607 with the founding of Jamestown, Virginia, England's first permanent colony in North America. Picture it: 104 settlers arrive on the swampy banks of the James River. They build a fort, plant crops, and immediately start dying. Turns out dreams of gold and Northwest passages don't make good survival strategies. The settlers weren't farmers, but gentlemen, men who'd packed more dice than plows. Within a year, famine, disease, and conflict with local Powhatan people had cut their numbers in half. Captain John Smith, yes, that John Smith of Disney fame, famously declared, "He that will not work shall not eat," a slogan that probably should have been printed on the colony's flag. Even with Smith's leadership, Jamestown faced what became known as the Starving Time in the winter of 1609–1610. Of 500 settlers, only 60 survived. The rest perished from hunger, and some, according to grim accounts, turned to cannibalism. Jamestown was teetering on the edge of abandonment, but then a miracle crop saved it. That miracle was tobacco. John Rolfe, who also married Pocahontas, introduced a sweeter variety of tobacco from the Caribbean. Suddenly, Europeans couldn't get enough of the stuff. Smoking wasn't just fashionable, it was profitable. By the 1620s, Jamestown was exporting tons of tobacco to England. Fields stretched where swamps had been, and every new ship brought more settlers eager to cash in. But tobacco was backbreaking labor. Enter indentured servants, poor Englishmen who signed away years of work in exchange for passage across the Atlantic. For a time, Virginia's plantations were filled with these indentured workers. Yet as demand grew, plantation owners turned increasingly to enslaved Africans. The first documented Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, a date many historians see as the beginning of slavery in English America. Virginia was becoming England's golden child, rich in exports, rich in opportunity, but built on exploitation and stolen land. Of course, none of this happened in a vacuum. The land around Jamestown belonged to the Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful alliance of native tribes. At first, there was trade, food for metal tools and weapons, but as English numbers grew, so did tensions. Pocahontas's marriage to John Rolfe is often portrayed as a fairy tale, but in reality, it was a fragile political truce. The peace broke down after Powhatan's death. In 1622, his brother Opchancanough led a massive uprising, killing around 350 settlers, a quarter of Virginia's English population. The English response: brutal retaliation, burning villages, destroying crops, and forcing survivors off their land. This was a grim preview of a pattern that would echo across America: trade, tension, treaty, and then violence. While Virginia grew wealthy on tobacco, another group of settlers was chasing something else entirely: freedom of worship. In 1620, a small group of religious separatists we know as the Pilgrims set sail on the Mayflower. They weren't chasing gold or even land. They wanted to practice their Puritan faith without harassment. Landing at Plymouth Rock, after getting lost, classic, they drafted the Mayflower Compact to covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. It was one of the first written frameworks for self-government in the New World. Life in New England was harsh, rocky soil, brutal winters, and fewer cash crops. But unlike Virginia, families migrated together and communities grew quickly. Town meetings, schools, and churches sprang up. The Puritans didn't build a tobacco empire, but they did build a society that would later give birth to very radical ideas like democracy. But again, there was the issue of land. In 1636, tensions erupted into the Pequot War, where English settlers, allied with rival native tribes, massacred the Pequots and virtually wiped them out. A generation later, King Philip's War 1675–1678 devastated New England. Metacom, called King Philip by the English, led a massive native alliance against the colonists. Towns burned, thousands died, and both sides suffered staggering losses. For New England settlers, it confirmed their view that they were chosen by God to tame a hostile wilderness. For native peoples, it was catastrophic, a sign of how relentless colonial expansion would be. By the late 1600s, two very different English societies were taking shape in America. One, Virginia, a plantation economy, hierarchical, reliant on indentured servants and increasingly enslaved Africans. Two, New England, tight-knit communities, religiously driven, with town meetings and schools, but also with a streak of intolerance for dissent. Ask Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, who were kicked out for having inconvenient opinions. Both shared one thing, however: expansion at the expense of native peoples. Here where things get interesting. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses was established in 1619, the first representative assembly in English America. In New England, the Mayflower Compact and town meetings encouraged participatory politics. These were tiny shoots, but they planted an idea. Englishmen overseas expected a voice in their own affairs. The irony: the same Parliament in London that supported slavery and enforced navigation laws had no intention of letting colonists run wild. But those seeds would grow. By the end of the 17th century, England's foothold in North America was secure. Tobacco wealth poured from Virginia. Puritan communities thrived in New England. Conflicts with native peoples reshaped the land forever. The colonies were young, fragile, and dependent on England, but also slowly becoming something distinct. And while settlers argued with natives and each other, back in England another storm was brewing. A revolution, the Glorious Revolution of 1688, would shake the monarchy and lay the foundation for a new kind of empire. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. See you there.